Stella Creasy, I have interviewed you before, and I know...
There's nothing new to say.
No, because of past experiences, when this interview is broadcast, you will get thousands of abusive comments on social media. How do you deal with that?
Well, I have tried to stop my mother using Twitter. No, I joke about it, and actually my mum always says, don't say that, because people really do think it is her. I think what it is particularly at the moment, because I've been talking a lot about maternity and how we make sure that mums have a voice, mother seems to be a really dirty word in British society at the moment. It's almost like women cannot win. Like if you have a baby, you should either disappear or the baby should disappear from public life. And if you want to try and combine the two, and if you want to say, actually, this is really weird, why do we expect motherhood to be about struggle? We don't ask anybody else to struggle in any other part of their lives. We try and help them. It's almost like, you know, you're committing some shocking act. So yeah, I'm not looking forward to the comments on that. It's fair to say, Gloria.
Are they mainly from men?
No, men and women. Women who I think particularly feel this idea that somehow we shouldn't make a fuss, because we make a fuss, we make ourselves victims. And I think that's completely daft. I want to make things better for every mum, because actually a lot of us talk about how difficult it is when you finally become a mum, and it took me a long time. I had a lot of struggles to have children, but I didn't stop being me. And the idea that somehow women should miss out because they carry children doesn't seem to sit right with me in a world where I want it to be more equal and full of possibility for everyone.
You say motherhood is a dirty word. You're fighting to change that. What is it? What practical changes do you want to happen?
Well, I think we saw it during the pandemic, didn't we, where we spent hours in Parliament debating how much money we were going to spend fixing potholes, and we gave parents a pat on the back for doing all that homeschooling. The evidence tells us in particular it was mums who really missed out during the pandemic, who ended up having to go on furlough or losing their jobs because they couldn't get childcare to look after their children. They couldn't get help to be able to do their jobs at the same time. And that means we miss out on their contribution for the workforce. So I've been working with fantastic organisations like This Mum Votes and Pregnant Then Screwed to try and change that. We also saw during the pandemic, pregnant women were completely abandoned. And I was actually pregnant myself during the pandemic, having debates and discussions with ministers and officials who were telling me that it wasn't an issue, the information that pregnant women were being given. I was given a leaflet telling me that, for example, that I couldn't have the vaccine until I'd finished breastfeeding my child. And then suddenly the information changed. Well, we've now seen a lot of pregnant women ended up in ICU because actually the risk that your child would get COVID and that you would get COVID and the risk of stillbirth, the risk of respiratory problems was much higher. So very often mums are the last people think about, and the changes and the challenges that they're facing. And as a consequence, we miss out on the contribution they can make. Other countries have invested in things like childcare because actually it pays for itself. When women can't work and make the choices about how they want to run their families, let alone dads spend time with their kids, everybody misses out, our economy, the families, and our communities. So I don't see this as particularly just about mums, but I see their voices as being missing, and I see it as being a hole that we need to fill in our democracy.
And as a mum MP, you have had your battles over how you are treated in Parliament as a mum, with the Speaker to start with. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a very simple principle for me. When we know that thousands of women still experience maternity discrimination in this country, the place that makes the laws on this should at least act like they matter as well. Otherwise, we're sending a message to employers that it doesn't really matter and there's no consequence. And yet Parliament wouldn't offer me proper maternity cover. So with my first child, I appointed somebody in spite of them. My second child, they saw me coming. They refused to let me do that. So I've had to take my son into all sorts of meetings. I've had to have him with me to make sure that I don't shortchange my constituents. Now, my constituency will so call it God's own country. I think it's the best place in the world. They're brilliant people, but they deserve a voice, especially during a pandemic, especially when they're facing all sorts of challenges with the cost of living crisis. But the day that I gave birth, we had meetings with the minister where I was high on morphine because I'd just given birth. But we had people who had family members in Afghanistan. And I couldn't say to them in a life or death situation, I'm really sorry, there's nobody else to cover this role. So there's nobody else to raise your family's concerns. So I took part in those meetings, just hoping that my son would be quiet enough to be able to get a word in edgeways with the ministers. That isn't an acceptable position in the 21st century. The thing that makes me really sad is that the leadership in the Commons has been particularly dismissive of the importance of this. And yet the Good Parliament project shows us we might be getting some women into politics, but on the whole, they're older, or they're childless. And the reason why they're older is that the barriers that exist to being able to combine being a good parent with being a good MP particularly hit women. So men still go into politics, but women don't. Changing that would help us open a whole new range of brilliantly talented people who the only issue is they've got kids, but who can make a real contribution in our politics. And, you know, let's face it, at the moment, Parliament really does need to change. So I think sending in the mums could be one way of doing it.
The leadership in Parliament, they have not been provided the leadership that you want, that you think could transform it and make...
I think one of the things I found particularly frustrating was that the leadership in Parliament, people like the speakers, went on TV and tried to shame my family for how we were organising ourselves. My partner works incredibly hard, but he can't breastfeed a baby, and that's what I was trying to do at the same time. And obviously your right to breastfeed is a protected thing unless you're a politician. And my challenge with that is I'm not asking for special treatment, but I'm asking for Parliament to set a standard, and as we know, standards in politics right now are a hot topic, for other employers. So when the leader of the House basically dismissed the idea that it was important to make sure that I could do that for my son and that there was proper maternity cover for me, and the parliamentary authorities told me that it was a problem and that I shouldn't have legal representation when I was talking to them about my rights as a mum, well, what message does that send? You know, I spend all my time talking to my constituents saying, you have rights, let me speak up for them, let me help you with them. And if I didn't do it myself, what message does that send? So we really have to change this culture where we first of all try and shame women about how they are mums. And I know there were other mums in Parliament who had different opinions, and that's great. I'm not going to criticise any mum for how she wants to run her life. But we should be making it possible for all mums to be part of our political process and for all mums to be heard in every workplace, because right now that isn't the case. And if maternity discrimination takes place in Parliament, it's not hard to see why it takes place in workplaces across the country.
Where next for you on this?
Oh, bed. Because with 2 children under the age of 3, I have to be honest, sleep is the thing I crave most of all. I have to say I wake up at most days in a slightly panicked fashion about where are they and what are they doing. I think this is really important. We have tried to recognise what we can do next. Change isn't going to come from within Parliament. When you've got people who feel, well, I struggled and I managed, so why shouldn't you? We need people with a different approach. That's why we set up This Mum Votes. This Mum Votes is a cross-party campaign calling all political parties to attention for what they're doing to get mums into politics and make sure that gap is filled. And then with the Labour Party in particular, I've worked with a number of women to set up a project called Motherhood to directly fund mums to stand for selection. Because if we're honest, the barriers exist well before you put a foot into Westminster. You know, the cost of standing for selection as a political candidate, and the parties are all doing their selections right now, are really high. It takes a lot of time. If you've got kids that you've got to try and organise childcare for at the same time, that's really prohibitive for people. So we fundraised to be able to have grants of up to £2,000 to mums who want to stand for selection. And I have to tell you, Gloria, it's blown my mind, the women who've come forward. They are absolutely amazing. And frankly, they're nothing like the current Parliament. 1/3 of them are from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. 20% of them are disabled. 1/3 of them are single parents. And 20% have children with special educational needs. A completely different cohort, lots of voices who we don't have in our politics right now. I'm fundraising so that I can fund as many of them as possible to stand for selection and make sure that childcare isn't a barrier for them doing that. And hopefully we'll be announcing shortly who those women are.
You said that change will not come from current Parliament. Have you had support from women on your own side of the House, women Labour MPs?
It's been a real mix, and it surprised me who's been supportive and said, actually, yeah, this is something that does need to change. And frankly, those people who haven't been supportive, I've spoken previously, it broke my heart to discover that the Labour Party Women's PLP wrote to the parliamentary authorities specifically to oppose a consultation on maternity cover for MPs, not even what that might be or might look like, and deal with any of the challenges that might come from that. Because I felt actually we were letting down, not me, it's too late for me. I promise you I'm never going to have any other children. I'm too old and it was too stressful the first time and the second time round. But all those women who are looking at Parliament and thinking, well, actually, could I do this and be a good mum? And I think it's entirely right that we ask what we can do to support those. And frankly, for the Labour movement, we should be at the forefront of that argument. After all, we stand for labour rights and employment rights rather than behind it. I was really touched that Theresa May reached out and spoke to the parliamentary authorities and supported the idea of locum MPs. And there have been MPs in different political parties who've come to me, and also younger MPs come to me saying, actually, this is going to affect me. But you know what, Gloria, I'm used to this now. I stick my head above the parapet, people scream and shout at me, and you have to listen, you have to understand if maybe you've got things wrong. But ultimately, if you believe in something, it's really worth the fight. People told me not to campaign on legal loan sharks. They told me not to campaign on abortion rights in Northern Ireland. I'm so pleased that we've made progress on that now. And I hope in 5 years' time, the debate around why it matters to make sure our politics is open to everyone, whether they're mums or not, dads or not, of any age, of any background, is fundamentally changed. Right now, we're at the point where people send a lot of abuse, and I get that. But one of the things that 10 years of being in Parliament has taught me is that things do move eventually.
Parliament's had a terrible time lately. Arguably, it's always been terrible on sexual harassment and misogyny, but now it's coming to light, which arguably is a good thing. At least people call it out and people lose their jobs as a result. Have you ever personally been subject to sexual harassment?
Yes. All my life. Actually, it started when I was at university, and to this day, I'm still terrified that I will run into again the group of men who did it, I was at university thank God, Facebook and social media, so they were limited in the tools that they had to do it. But I'll never forget the night that I was in a room with them all and they threatened to gang rape me, let alone the posters that they put up around the college when I had the temerity to stand for a position in the student union, telling people not to vote for me because of who I'd slept with. And that happened at a Cambridge college. I wish I could tell you from the stories that I hear from young women that sexual harassment in our universities isn't an issue anymore. I think it still is. I tell you that because I think that culture isn't unique to Parliament, where there's privilege and entitlement. And frankly, it's always the men that people think is least likely to do it who are involved in it. Because certainly the young men, and they were men at the time, they were late teenagers, have gone on to be doctors and civil servants and high flyers. But I tell you that because I think we need to have an honest conversation about why this isn't changing anytime soon. Many of us started talking about the sexual harassment and misogyny and discrimination that we saw when we first got elected in 2010. Well, it's now 2022, and these stories are achingly familiar. I'm really pleased that we have an independent complaints process in Parliament, but frankly, it isn't moving quick enough. And I know too many cases where women are still too frightened to come forward. People are too frightened to talk about what's going on and what the outcomes are and what happens in terms of people defending their friends rather than recognising that we have to change that culture worries me, because we only get an opportunity to refresh our Parliament and bring in those new voices every 4 or 5 years. I know we've been having elections more frequently than that, but I think that's going to change now. And, you know, one of the things that really troubles me is that 41% of people in this country just think that democracy doesn't work anymore. When you have that many people who think that, that's when extremes come into politics. That's when people start being able to say, well, we need other ways of running the country. I'm a passionate defender of democracy as I'm a passionate defender of socialism. So I know we have to get our house in order to get our country in order.
Stella, that story of what happened to you at Cambridge made me send shivers down my spine, and not in a good way. Did anything happen?
Oh no, I was held up and I was admonished by the college authorities at the time because they chose to believe the idea that I was probably a wronged woman. And as I say, it took public humiliation and posters and finally other people coming forward and me collating the evidence of all the notes, the spitting in my room, the rubbish that was thrown at me, the sexual abuse and harassment if I tried to walk into the bar that came from this group of young men. I'm in my mid-40s now, and it's the first time I've really felt even willing to talk about it. And I think one of the things about this is that people expect women all the time to be, and someone said to me, oh, well, you're not a wallflower, as if it doesn't happen to women if they're not strong. It was terrifying at the time. As I say, I'm terrified I'll ever run into those young men again. And I say that because several years after I left university, I did exactly that. I walked into a bar and they were all sat there and I collapsed inside and left as soon as I could. So once it's happened to you, it will always shape you. But one of the things I want to say to women who've experienced those things in life and to the women in Parliament now is you will find allies. You will find those of us prepared to stand with you because we know what it's like. We know how hard it is and we know the impact it can have on you. I want to see real change in our universities in the same way that I want to see real change in our schools, because I think we still have problems with sexual harassment in schools. One of the reasons I stood for Parliament, one of the reasons that I stand now is to be able to change some of those things. And I know you were like that too, Gloria, where you refused to accept that this was just the way of the world. But one of the things I think 12 years into being an MP is that the pace of change is achingly slow. And as much as it's about the changes we want to see, it's how quickly we can get there. I look now at my little daughter who's 2.5 years old. I look at my son who's 8 months old. I want them to inherit a very different world, and I'm determined that we make that happen. So 12 years into being an MP, I share my story about the sexual harassment I've experienced. I look at what's happening in Parliament now, and I say it's about deeds, not words. So whether it is fighting to get more mothers into Parliament, refusing to be told by my colleagues to shut up talking about the challenges that we face, or wanting to work with groups in society like Pregnant and Screwed and empower those women and empower those different voices to come forward, I'm more determined than ever.
Wow. Stella Creasy. Thank you. Sincerely.